Beşi geçti. Onun için ben başlayayım isterseniz. Okay. I'm switching to English from now on. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today in a new event of the TEDU Center for Gender Studies. Today we are with Ece Kocabıçak, Dr. Ece Kocabıçak. First, I would like to thank her for joining us, accepting our invitation to talk about her book. And with her permission, I'm going to be a moderator and a discussant today. So I will start with introducing her briefly and then continue with my discussant role. But I just realized that I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Gülçin Con Wright. I am a part of the Center for Gender Studies. I am in Sociology department, and I'm very excited today. So I'm not sure if me or Ece is more excited, but I will refer to her as Ece with her permission. So thank you again for coming here and being a part of us, and also giving us the opportunity to talk about your book. And again, I'm going to just give a very brief introduction to your biography. So Ece Kocabıçak is currently working as a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the Open University in the UK. She completed her PhD in sociology at Lancaster University. Prior to joining the Open University, Ece was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research engages with contemporary debates in comparative sociology, feminist political economy, and international development. Her expertise is on the ways in which varieties of gender regimes diversify the trajectories of capitalist development, state formation, and civil society in the Global South, and the interactions between the patriarchal, capitalist, and racist collective subjects. Ece's recent book, titled The Political Economy of Patriarchy in the Global South, has been nominated for the prestigious 2023 British Sociological Association's Philip Adams Memorial Prize. Again, thank you so much. We are so happy to be with you. And the book that I just mentioned, which got the nomination for that prize, and hopefully it will also get the prize, we will discuss this book. Obviously, Ece is going to give her own talk about the book, but first, I want to point to several points that I derived from this book. I had the chance to read it because she sent me a copy. I'm also thankful for that. And I think that it makes very important contributions to our discussions in feminist research and feminist circles for the reasons that I will state in a second. But I had the chance to read it very carefully. I took my time to take notes. I realized that some of the conversations are the conversations that I'm familiar with, being a sociologist. Obviously, this is a common point between us. The Marxist discussions and the discussions about patriarchy or global South or even agrarian transformation. But at the same time, I learned a lot of things that I was not aware of or I didn't think about. So it definitely broadened my vision about the discussions on patriarchy. I took a lot of notes, and I'll also use a lot of your references. I read your other work as well to see how you came to this point, to this book. And I do believe that this is going to be a very important reference book for everyone who's working in the field of, whether feminist research, anything about gender, or anything about agrarian transformation, political economy, and Turkey and global South broadly. So the first thing that I really like about this book is obviously from the title and from the overall discussion that it brings to, is that it takes patriarchy back into the discussions in feminist research. And you might say, okay, where did patriarchy go? That's, Ece brought back patriarchy. Well, she actually gives us some criticisms about the current discussions, more contemporary discussions in the feminist research, pointing that we are getting a bit more away from the causal analysis of gender inequalities towards focusing on gaps between men and women, and also analyzing the gendered outcomes or gendered preconditions of capitalist development rather than focusing on the patriarchal regimes. And while doing that, she claims that if we do not focus on the causes of gender inequality, then we cannot afford women's liberation from the patriarchal system. These are in her words. We would be more dealing with women's empowerment within the patriarchal system. And when she obviously directs our attention to the cause and analysis of the gender inequalities, she also makes the point that the current discussions about the peasantry in Turkey or overall in Global South are ungendered, like in the sense that they are not focusing on the gendered dimensions of this agrarian path or agrarian transformation. And at the same time, anything about any theories, any discussions about the role of state within these discussions is very away from focusing on its patriarchal characteristics as well. So in that sense, she's starting from the point of focusing on what she calls as, and obviously driving from the theories of gender regimes, the pre-modern patriarchy, which is about the exclusion of women from the means of production. In this case, it is land, because Turkey is a unique case with small land ownership and still the reliance on small farms, which can only be sustainable through unpaid family labor of women that men exploit on a regular basis. And because of women being excluded from land ownership up until the current civil code in 2000s, this was basically affordable to sustain. And in that sense, pre-modern patriarchy was driving the forces or driving the sustainability of patriarchal system in Turkey in several different areas that I'm going to get into in a second. But I want to also point out another criticism that she provided to the existing gender theories. And I want to focus on her criticism about the social reproduction theories, something that we are familiar with from the Marxist feminist theorists discussing that capitalism is the reason why women are locked in the unpaid family labor, household labor within the reproductive work area, reproductive care. But she points out that actually the line between reproduction and production is blurry, and we cannot solely focus on unpaid work that women have within the household domain. We need to also focus on production. And in that sense, it was very, very important for me as well, because we do focus on women's unpaid labor in the household a lot. Being a family sociologist, I do that too, and not draw the connections between the reproduction and production or unpaid family labor and unpaid work in other areas. And while doing that, she actually provides a very complex theoretical framework. As I mentioned, the pre-modern patriarchy being about the gender exclusion from the means of production, land, there's also modern patriarchy, which together with pre-modern patriarchy forms domestic patriarchy. And by modern patriarchy, she means gender exclusion from subsistence, meaning any income generating activities. So a lot of women being housewives in urban settings is a good example of how modern patriarchy also works at the same time, coexist with the pre-modern patriarchy. And she doesn't stop there. She also talks about public patriarchy as on top of domestic patriarchy. In this case, the role of the patriarchal state in continuing sustaining the burden, the double burden of unpaid and paid work for women, especially in urban areas. And what she does is not to give these bits and pieces as in a linear form, where any countries in the world, especially the ones in the global south, would move from pre-modern to modern, and then eventually the public patriarchy would develop, and this would be progress. She actually points out through analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, focusing on Turkey, that they can all coexist together. And Turkey is a good example for this coexistence of pre-modern, modern, and public, especially neoliberal public patriarchy. So we need to acknowledge that heterogeneity is a more part of patriarchal regime rather than trying to categorize Turkey with either one of these different forms of patriarchy's visibility. And another point about the discussion on the Global South, the dominant explanations for patriarchy in Global South fall into the trap of providing essentialist interpretations. And she also acknowledges that defining the patriarchy in several countries through its religious or cultural components. And she doesn't do that. Actually, she provides a cross-cultural comparison in chapter 7, comparing Turkey with the countries in the similar economic development like Argentina, Chile, Malaysia, and South Africa. And then another group of countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Egypt, and provides the understanding that it's not necessarily about culture and religion that defines what patriarchal regime that we're in, but more about, again, going back to the small land ownership and women's explosion from the agrarian labor production as well. And this overall picture, the theoretical framework and the analysis, including the historical analysis of Turkish Republic and also the comparative analysis of Turkey with other countries, drives the conclusion or the framework that she provides to rely on two very important components that I will also ask her to maybe expand a little bit. The first one is that she understands that men have this collective agency as being the patriarchal subject to bargain with the patriarchal state to first establish and then sustain this gender-based exclusion, whether this is pre-modern or modern. And she gives a lot of examples from the history of Turkish Republic and also contemporary Turkey. These men do have this power, not only through politics, but also through their role in civil society. And another culprit, maybe, is the heterosexual cisgendered family, here being the mediator in terms of both sustaining this patriarchal regime, but also maintaining the shift from one form of patriarchy to another. And she doesn't leave us with this green picture. She actually has a lot of recommendations at the very end of the book. She provides the understanding of different feminist strategies that we can develop. And one of the most important driver in this country is the feminist movement. But while doing that, actually, she again provides a very unique perspective by saying that we have so many subdivisions in feminist movement too. Obviously, we all know that, but she also drives our attention to how there should be better understanding of rural versus urban women's experiences, Kurdish and other minorities' experiences, Alawi and other religious minorities' experiences, and at the same time, class-based differences among women's experiences with patriarchy. Because even when the Turkish state provides commercialized services in the area of care, for example, only well-educated, higher income women from urban areas were able to afford these care experiences so that they can lower their double burden of paid and unpaid work, but not the other group of people. So this is one of the obstacles, but at the same time, it can be our strength, especially in terms of feminist movement forming coalition with LGBTQIA and environmentalists and other minority movements in Turkey. One obstacle is the collective agency power of men continuously working, and the current backlash, gender backlash in Turkey and in the world overall shows that their power is very much alive and very much strong. But related to that, actually, I was going to ask her to maybe give us a more in-depth analysis or more in-depth explanation on this collective agency of men working, because she gives examples. We do understand that it's through politics and through civil society, but I am not exactly sure how it works on a daily basis, through voting, through elections, through organizations. And how can we acknowledge the subdivisions among the men as the patriarchal powers as well? Because we do acknowledge the divisions among women in terms of their interests. Then what about the interests of different groups of men? Let's say rural versus urban, secular versus religious, Kurdish versus Turkish, and any other subdivisions that I cannot think of right now. Are we going to assume that they are a homogeneous group with a set interest working on a plan, or is it more organic and happening on a different scale than I can maybe imagine right now? Another point, because I'm a family sociologist, I really love the emphasis on family. And I do understand that families has a very important mediating role here, especially men being the male, the head of the households and being in charge of all the decision making. But again, on a daily basis, how does it work? Meaning, how does it work in daily interactions between the men and women? Because men have the agency, but so do women. And I am very much following Barbara Risman's Gender as a Social Structure theory in her approach to family. And she proposes that all the gender inequalities within the family works at three levels: individual, interactional, and institutional. And this book gives a very clear picture of how at the institutional level, family is a very important institution in maintaining the patriarchal exploitation of women's labor. But at the interactional level between men and women on a daily basis, how do women not revolt? How do men sustain their power? Domestic violence is one of the examples that you also provide, but I'm assuming that there are non-violent and more consent-giving ways, consent being here, not in terms of Candiotti's patriarchal bargaining, but still some form of consent. And finally, I want to mention that I do enjoy you focusing on Turkey as your case and then providing the cross-cultural comparison. But from time to time, I wondered whether you also see the impact of any international organization or any international entity on what is happening within the borders of Turkish states. Turkish state being patriarchal, bargaining with the collective power of men, collective agency of men, definitely provides the backlashes. But any reforms that happen, especially between 2000 and 2010, might they be because of the discussions, the membership discussions between EU and Turkey? Because this discussion, EU membership discussion, definitely brought so many reforms towards gender equality in Turkey, even though we see backlashes to those reforms. I would say that everything is not about what is happening between the collective agency of men and the patriarchal states, but there are some additional actors in this game. And even though I'm not going to dare to say that EU is not patriarchal, still they might be more in line with the social democratic form of public patriarchy as you proposed. And that might be also one of the ways to reach to the exit strategy as you also proposed. And finally, just a final comment. When I was reading, especially chapter 7, your comments about the rural household earnings being higher than the proletarization of these former farmers was not at high levels. The urbanization was not very fast, and the workers' wages were relatively higher compared to other countries in the same economic development. You provide percentages about the labor force participation of men in Turkey. And from time to time, there's a labor force participation of women as well. I do know that you obviously are aware of the informal sector in Turkey, and informal sector percentages are not being published on a regular basis. So I was just curious whether some part of the impact of the agrarian transformation on the urban wages, what is the role of informal sector in this whole scenario? So that's end of my points and my critiques. Thank you so much again. I really enjoyed the book, as you can understand, because I did have a lot of points to point out. I will use this for sure, even in my, further research on any studies related to household labor and also care work, because it does provide a broader picture that I can situate the Turkish context in. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gülçin. You have provided amazing summary of the key arguments and the way I think, actually. Thank you so much for your summary and also your questions as well. And also thank you, TED University Gender Studies Department, to invite me to this talk today. I will answer your questions throughout my presentation, if it is okay. And I'm going to share my screen now. And sorry, did it? I wonder if you see my screen. Yes? Okay. Again, thank you so much for inviting me. I like to start with the reasons for writing this book, focusing on this issue, why I spent years to focus on that relationship between patriarchy and capitalism and political economy of patriarchy. Before academia, or until the early years of my academic experience, I was involved in a feminist movement, mostly in Istanbul, also some different cities, different countries as well. And during my feminist praxis, the question of how to destabilize the patriarchal system was generally answered in two major ways, like either left-wing or left-wing organizations around us try to explain how capitalism either empowers or weakens patriarchy, but at the end of the day, it was capitalism that we all need to unite against and fight. And or they quickly talked about cultural and religious conditions in Turkey or Turkey-like Muslim majority countries, and they try to explain the patriarchal dynamics by drawing on cultural arguments and cultural essentialist arguments, actually. And with this book, I tried to do two things. I tried to show that capitalism is not always the key determinant of social change. Depending on geographical, historical context, depending on the collective struggles of different groups, capitalism may not determine the patriarchy. Actually, opposite can happen. Patriarchal relations of labor can shape, diversify the trajectories of capitalism. And then at the same time, I tried to show that patriarchy is not just about culture. Of course, there's a cultural dimension, but patriarchy also establishes very specific labor relations, and it draws on those patriarchal labor relations. So I try to do two things with this book. And the book has three parts, generally. The first part engages with theoretical debate. In doing so, it engages with two different clusters of debate. One is about theories on capitalism. The other one is theories on gender inequality, gender oppression and inequality. And then after this engagement, I provide my conceptual framework that is tested throughout the book. And the second part is dedicated to data analysis. In the second part, there are 4 chapters in the second part. I test my conceptual framework by focusing on the data. And the last part talks about theory mostly, and the reflections. I reflect on data analysis, and I try to propose a new theoretical framework to analyze social inequalities in societies. And then I try to discuss about the political implications, what could be the best effective feminist strategies within the context of Turkey, which can destabilize gender inequality. So in part 1 of the book, I focus on 2 clusters of work. The first cluster is about capitalist theories. I call them the ungendered accounts of capitalist development. So here I try to explain that those theories do not consider gender. They don't pay enough attention to gender. They either focus on the role of capitalism in shaping society, and when the capitalism is not enough to explain what's going on, they quickly shift to cultural, religious, essentialist position. And I also criticize, like Gülçin mentioned, criticize the feminist critique of those capitalist theories on capitalism. And I highlighted some of the problems in that feminist critique. The second cluster of work is about feminist theories on gender inequality. Of course, there are various feminist theories on gender inequality, but my main focus was the social reproduction theory and also varieties of gender regime theories. So I focused on these two clusters of work in the first part of the book. So if I briefly summarize, in the first chapter, I criticized major theories that explain capitalist development in the global south. Like in some of those theories, try to explain how proletarianization worked within the countries like Turkey. Like they focused on the labor movement from agriculture to subsistence agriculture to manufacturing and services sectors. But those theories never consider what happens if they never consider, first of all, that this proletarianization is gendered from the start. And they also don't consider what happens if unpaid farm work is heavily gendered. In other words, if women are working as unpaid family workers on the farm, and then how these women experience loss of barriers to migrate to relatively urban areas and join the paid labor. So when they don't consider this gendered condition, they never notice that actually some countries have significant, and they still have significant gender gaps in the shift from agriculture to non-agricultural labor. So this is not in their agenda, but this is a significant indicator to understand any kind of social transformation. You don't have to be feminist. If you like to understand socio-economic transformation, you need to see this gender gap. Also, patriarchal path of agrarian transformation is a concept that I used in order to emphasize that existing theories on agrarian transformation dismiss this particular path. I argue that when women are predominantly in working as unpaid laborers in agriculture, agrarian transformation happens in a way which is very different to other countries. Like when Gülçin has mentioned my comparative analysis in chapter 7, like when I look at the agrarian transformation in Latin American countries, also in Malaysia, South Africa, and some different countries, I realized that agricultural labor quickly shifted to paid labor. So either via colonialism or state-owned massive farms, and agrarian workers started to be waged workers very quickly. But in some countries like Turkey, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Morocco, Egypt, in those countries, dominance of small land ownership shaped the agrarian structure. So agrarian labor force is heavily unpaid labor force, and they are predominantly women. So under these conditions, they say penetration of capitalism into agriculture happens very differently. And those theories also dismiss this transformation. And also, when they talk about the uneven and combined development theories, rightly emphasize the significance of non-capitalist actors in developing countries or global south. They talked about the role of sheikhs, they talk about the role of religious leaders, tribal communities, and they try to say that it is not just capitalist classes, but also non-capitalist classes are influential in social transformation. But again, they do not take peasants, their understanding of peasant is purely ungendered. They don't take gender as a significant category, and then they don't see the difference between land-owning male peasants who strictly control the ownership of land and female peasants who work on the land as unpaid family laborers. I briefly mentioned the ungendered perception of the state. I try to explain how state has multiple agendas, not just capitalist agenda, but state has racist agenda and also patriarchal agenda, and how these patriarchal agenda or interplay between those multiple agendas is significant for social change. And like I mentioned, I acknowledge the feminist critique of capitalist theories on capitalist development. They provide really valuable critical assessment of those ungendered theories. However, their accounts tend to reduce the relationship between gender and development, either to the gendered outcomes of or the gender prerequisites for capitalist development. In other words, they explain how capitalist development affects women differently to men, or they identify, they investigate how gender is a precondition for capitalist development. So what is missing here is they dismiss that gender, varieties of gender regime can effectively shape trajectories of capitalist development. And they also, the relationship between racist regime and patriarchal system can also change the social transformation. So in my opinion, these theories slightly dismiss this point. And then I continue with the second cluster of work that I mentioned in chapter 2, and I focus on social reproduction theories and theories on varieties of gender regime. So, social reproduction theories, in my opinion, are valuable in terms of their adoption of historical materialist methodology and ontology. But they have some problems which make me distance from that theories a little bit. First of all, like kind of contradicting to the what I'm trying to show, that these theories rely on the assumption that there is a one-sided deterministic relationship in which the capitalist relations of labor, or capitalism actually, dictate patriarchal relations of labor. So therefore, they assume that patriarchal relations of labor are purely restricted to the domain of reproduction, and capitalism is ruling reproduction and production and also shaping the patriarchal relations of labor because capitalism needs patriarchy. I think this critique is already highlighted by French materialist feminists previously, but there are two more differences, two more issues, I think, in social reproduction feminism. The second one is when they try to explain the reasons for gender-based division of labor within the home, they heavily draw on biological essentialist understandings of gender, like gender and sex. Like they talk about the role of giving a birth, they talk about the role of lactation, and they dismiss the role of social construction in terms of breastfeeding, in terms of reproduction. And I think they shift into a domain which is slightly biological essentialist. And finally, this point is also important. They assume that capitalist transformation happens everywhere in the same way. Capitalism detaches laborers, direct producers, from means of production, including land. Like when they talk about agriculture, they heavily talk about land grabbing. capitalist or colonialist powers taking land from peasants and turning peasants to dispossessing peasants, turning them into wage laborers. But Turkey is a capitalist country. India is a capitalist country, and they have significant level of manufacturing capacity in terms of worldwide level. But like I said, capitalism doesn't work in the same way that it did in England or France or other Canada or United States. But they dismiss this difference. And this difference is very important in our analysis of patriarchal system. I also critically engage with theories on varieties of gender regime. As I am member of this research group, theories of varieties of gender regime, my critique continues. It's a bit of a painful position. I have to criticize them all the time. The main problem is gender regime theories use complexity theory. And complexity theory creates some problems for effective feminist strategies. First of all, I acknowledge that they take racism, capitalism, and patriarchy as equally important, but at the same time, domains which are economy, politics, civil society, and violence, those domains are also systems. They are also regimes and equally significant to those three regimes. And this creates lots of problems. First of all, it obscures the causality in terms of gender oppression and inequality. So it dismisses the role of patriarchal labor relations in the family and patriarchal exploitation of labor. And also, it doesn't acknowledge that family cannot be a domain, or inequalities occur in the family cannot be dispersed amongst other domains, because family plays a very, very significant role in entire patriarchal relations of labor. Like I will try to explain later, family mediates those relationships. Like in capitalism, relations of wage mediates the patriarchal exploitation of labor. Workers don't think that they're exploited. But in the family, family itself, when I say family, I mean cisgender heterosexual family, the exploitative labor relations are mediated through the family. And this is a very unique category, specific to patriarchy, needs to be acknowledged. And what happens when those theoretical limitations dominate our feminist strategies? I argue that there are significant political implications caused following those theoretical issues. Like, first of all, in chapter 3, I start with the political implications of these theoretical problems. First of all, these problems limit feminist analysis to a focus on gender gaps in, for example, in economy, political representation, different or wealth and property. And then it creates some kind of a naive solution in terms of patriarchy. Like, for example, it's a very well-known book, which claims to be a radical feminist book, written by Caroline Carrillo Perez. In her book, she points to unintentional male bias as the cause of gender inequality. So she suggests that increased representation of women in science, technology, economy, and politics is the solution to patriarchy. So again, when we lose the cause of patriarchy, secondly, like Gülçin also summarized, our feminist goal of women's liberation, pure liberation from patriarchy, becomes women's empowerment within the patriarchal system. So we all start to think about strategies that how to empower women, how to make their life bearable in this patriarchal system. And I think this shift from causes towards aspects of patriarchy is the reason that we don't spend enough effort to think about liberation. And also, once the causality is concealed, I think feminist strategies become distorted by interpreting certain biological differences as the cause of patriarchy. So having or not having some bodily parts become increasingly interpreted as the reason of patriarchy. And this is a purely biological essentialist position that feminists themselves fought against for years. And fourth point is, there is also a certain level of neglect towards the collective acting capacity of men. And the category of men, like which I will explain a bit more, includes different groups of men, but their collective acting capacity needs to be considered to develop effective feminist strategies. If we don't acknowledge that capacity, we develop solutions, like I mentioned, based on unintentional male bias. They oppress us, but they are not aware of that, or something like the old culture again. But I think United Nations campaign He for She is very crystal clear example of this neglect of the collective acting capacity. And finally, when we try to find strategies against patriarchy, automatically, when you assume that capitalism shapes patriarchy, we start to think about capitalism rather than the distinguishing features of patriarchy. So in light of these political implications, I try to propose a theory of a patriarchal system. And I put patriarchal relations of labor, patriarchal labor exploitation, as the core of my theory. In my analysis, exploitation of labor is a purely social relationship in which dominating sections of society appropriate the surplus produced by the subordinated sections. So far, this exploitation of labor can be class, gender, racial. But surplus, it's important to acknowledge that surplus occurs when subordinated group is made to work for longer than they required by their own needs. So exploitation of labor can happen in capitalism in a very specific way that we all know, but it can also happen in patriarchal system and also in racism as well. So I thought when you focus on the patriarchal relations of labor, of course, I needed to explain what is distinctive about this form of labor exploitation. The ways in which surplus is produced is very different to other systems of exploitation. The ways in which this surplus is appropriated is very different. And then in order to make it more clear, I also needed to explain what is patriarchal exploitation and also what is not patriarchal exploitation. And then I try to explain the distinctiveness of this patriarchal labor exploitation. And then I focused on the collective subject. I think Gülçin's question was also about it. Like I explain later, I heavily use Hegelian Marxist understanding of historical materialism. So collective consciousness, self-in-consciousness plays a significant role in the reproduction of these systems. So gender-based dominating group, men as a gender-based dominant group, they develop a collective acting capacity according to my theory. So this group can include men as head of households, and in some cases they can be male wage workers as well. And in some cases, like I address later in the book, it can be also male small producers, male farmers or urban small producers. I think in Turkish, good word, esnaf, they can be part of patriarchal collective subject. And Gülçin mentioned about on a daily basis, how it works. I think in the establishment of varieties of patriarchy, in my data analysis chapters, I try to explain how during the late Ottoman, early Republican time period, male peasants, irrespective of their differences, irrespective of their ethnicity, religion-based differences, they managed to collectively act together to control land ownership, to establish their dominance over the land ownership. And at the same time, in urban areas, non-agricultural urban areas, men in their position as small producers collectively reacted against women's access to those small businesses. And they got organized, and each group negotiated with the state to establish their dominance over property or income generating activities. So when we think about if we jump from 2020, then I think about Istanbul Convention. My recent work is about the patriarchal character of Turkish state, and I think Turkish article is published in Mülkiye recent last issue, Feminist Politics special issue in Mülkiye. And in that article, I try to explain how men are mobilized against Istanbul Convention and how different groups of men came together, and at the same time how elite men, despite their class differences, how elite men supported these groups of men, and then the result was Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. So I think what happened in Turkey and some other countries as well, all of the countries I can say, I think nowadays, it's getting more clear that men have very strong collective acting capacity. Another example, this morning I was reading the news and I come across two political opposition leaders giving their declarations from the kitchen of another Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu actually. They met in his kitchen and all the pictures are taken when they were in the kitchen. For me, it's a very special photograph. So rather than in a luxurious room or different places, they declare their economic solutions from the kitchen of a house. Kitchen is the location of unpaid work. Kitchen is the location of women. Kitchen is the location of work that doesn't acknowledge its necessity, is not acknowledged enough. So I really like that photograph itself, irrespective of anything, just the photograph that two male politicians talking about economy and they are sitting on a kitchen table and background was the kitchen. So I really like this photograph, but automatically I started to think, what would other men will think? Would they be happy that those men think in the kitchen? Would they acknowledge the significance of kitchen, or they will start thinking that it's a woman's place, why they are in the kitchen, why they are talking like they are sitting like a woman, talking like a woman, what is this? And unfortunately, irrespective of the political parties, these men can support the current regime or not, but this patriarchal bias, this collective solidarity is established across different political views. And I think Istanbul Convention, the discussion around Istanbul Convention also reveals that cross-party solidarity amongst men. And of course, I also try to explain that there are some group of men, they betray the patriarchal collective subject. I call them betrayals. So when they betray, like when they try to do the work that women do in the kitchen or looking after children or in agriculture, actually it is very, very clear, like collecting cotton is a woman's job. Men are not supposed to collect cottons. For some reason, all labor-intensive tasks are women's tasks in agriculture. And in some households, they can't afford that. Head of male household has to collect the cotton. Cotton has to be collected within 10 days. And if you don't collect, it's ruined. So he has to collect the cotton. But what happens? Other men in the village strictly criticize that man, and they really humiliate that man in coffee kahve. And then they prevent those men from collecting cotton. They send their wives to help that household to collect the cottons rather than watching a man collecting cottons, because it's directly threatening gender-based division of labor, directly threatening their benefits that they get from agriculture. So I wonder if I managed to explain a little bit how this works, but we can talk later, more detailed. And in my theory of patriarchy, I differentiate systems of exploitation from regimes of oppression. I believe that the exploitation depends on the labor of exploited. Therefore, the need to be exploited, there is a certain level of consent. So in order to exploit someone's labor, that person, in patriarchal capitalism, there should be a consent, and this consent is guaranteed by relations of mediation. But when we talk about regimes of oppression, there is no labor exploitation. In other words, oppressor doesn't depend on the oppressed. So their ultimate goal is to get rid of the oppressed. And I think racism is a regime. It draws on this kind of relationships, but capitalism and patriarchy are more like systems of exploitation. So I'm going a bit quickly here, and I try to theorize the rural forms of patriarchy, and drawing on the gender regime theories, I engage with the existing debate on rural forms of patriarchy, and I come back with the idea of pre-modern and modern forms of domestic patriarchy. So in theories of gender regimes, theorize public patriarchy and domestic patriarchy. And on top of that, they argue that public patriarchy has neoliberal and social democratic varieties. And currently, they also start to argue that there is also authoritarian form of public patriarchy. But their focus is all about public patriarchy because they focus on the West. They focused on the US, Canada, and Europe. But when we look at the countries in the global South, you see that domestic patriarchy is still very strong. The main difference between public and domestic is about women's access to resources. In domestic, women they don't have access, they are excluded. Their major place is home. They can't access paid employment, higher level of education, property ownership. They are predominantly inside the household. But in public, access is equal, more or less equal. Paid labor is shared between men and women, but women are subordinated in certain occupations. So when I look at these theories, I realize that domestic patriarchy needs to be differentiated. There should be pre-modern form, which draws on this unpaid family labor and production. So women's labor is used in production, and that surplus in production is appropriated by men. And modern form, women's labor is used in in-house production, mostly for care. And in Turkey, I believe we have these two forms of patriarchy, also in other global southern countries. So the part 2 is the main findings. So I wonder, it's time is 12 o'clock, Gülçin. So when shall I finish? I wonder.
I went till like 25 or so, so it's been only 35 minutes, but I don't know.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
Okay, shall I finish within 20 minutes? 20 minutes then? Will it be fine? Okay.
15 to 20 minutes probably.
Okay, thank you. So when we look at the main findings here, what I found is this part has 4 chapters. First of all, I focused on the early Republican period to demonstrate how pre-modern and modern forms of patriarchy have been established in Turkey. And in this process, I think what I call, I adopt the concept from Valentin Mokatan, the patriarchal gender contract plays an important role. So the state had multiple agendas, and state's nationalist agenda and capitalist agenda and patriarchal agenda played a significant role in increasing the bargaining capacity of patriarchal collective subjects. So when I say bargaining capacity, I mean male peasants found themselves in a suitable environment that they can negotiate with the state and legally exclude women from land ownership. So land inheritance laws were designed in a way which legally dispossessed women. Women couldn't inherit land, agricultural land, under a certain scale if they have a brother. So until 2015, this discrimination continued in the law. And the modern form is also established, like men actively get organized and mobilized against women's access to small businesses, paid employment, and I give examples here and how this happened. And first wave feminist movements were active against this discriminations, but women were divided. So this was the, I think, very important division, that the feminist movement didn't realize that rural women experience a different form of patriarchy and they need to develop different strategies. So during the early Republican period, the pre-modern and modern forms were established and they had a very strong ground. And then I slightly jumped to 2000, so I try to understand what happens. So I see that in 2000s, neoliberal patriarchy has started to be established. Since 2000s, some women shifted to double burden, so they work under the conditions of paid and unpaid labor. It is not just unpaid labor at home or on the farm. State's patriarchal character started to change a little bit. Civil society had the magnificent changes, actually. The most progressive domain was the civil society until 2013-14. And state interventions in violence against women were significant. States started to criminalize violence. And in that respect, like Gülçin has mentioned, international institutions like European Union membership discussions have played a significant role. But when I look at the overall picture, I have noticed that despite the emergence of neoliberal patriarchy, pre-modern and modern domestic patriarchy still is the dominant hegemonic form of patriarchy in Turkey. Then I try to provide a map. I try to map these forms of patriarchy based on some indicators that I'm not going into details now. So here, the lines are neoliberal public patriarchy, and the dots are pre-modern, and those little vegetable-looking like signs are modern domestic patriarchy. When you look at the geography of neoliberal public patriarchy, you see that there are some cities, main cities like İzmir, Ankara, Istanbul, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cities are having neoliberal public patriarchy very strongly, but we cannot say that they are dominated by the neoliberal form. Modern domestic is still strong in those cities. So what does it mean? In those cities, women access paid employment and advanced level of education. Their political representation and engagement with the public decision-making is higher. There are smaller gender gaps in those cities. Women's control over their reproductive abilities, also sexual orientation and sexuality is higher than other cities. And violence is criminalized, so women can access a certain level of protection. However, in the rest of the country, as you can see, what I found is pre-modern and modern domestic patriarchy is dominating the society. which means women's access to those public resources are more restricted, violence is more accepted, their control over their body is more limited. So when I look at this overall picture, I see that the hegemony of the domestic patriarchy is much stronger than other countries, other regions. So this, of course, diversifies women's experiences. So when I look at this table, I try to understand. Well, first of all, I realize that when we do the division between urban and rural, it really doesn't fit into patriarchal relations. So a standard way of dividing rural areas from urban areas doesn't explain differences between women. So I identified non-agrarian cities that have so little to do agriculture. I identified agrarian cities, the main economic activities still around agriculture, but also there are semi-agrarian cities that they are not purely drawing on services or manufacturing. They still have agriculture and service sectors around agriculture, like warehouse, transportation, stocking, so it is not really urban and rural when we look at the case of Turkey. And female peasants are not only in agrarian cities or villages, they can also be in semi-agrarian cities. And they experience pre-modern form of domestic patriarchy. Their labor, unpaid labor, is not only in household, but it's also in the farm. Farm work is very important for them. They can't access education higher than basic level, primary school. And we can't talk about public provisioning of childcare, really. There is nothing. They handle between each other. Eldest daughter look after children, or sometimes kids are on the field as well. And their mobility, migration is very limited. Their control over their sexuality, including reproductive abilities, is very limited, and no protection against gender violence. Women who predominantly experience modern domestic patriarchy are full-time homemakers. They are everywhere, like you remember the map. They are really everywhere. And their labor is unpaid and confined into households. They can access and sometimes secondary level of education and very limited access to childcare provisioning. Mobility is also limited and very low protection against violence. Female wage workers are different. They are in non-agrarian cities and they experience neoliberal patriarchy. They experience double burden of paid and unpaid labor. They access secondary level of education and sometimes advanced level of education. And they have relatively higher level of access to public provisioning of childcare. Again, mobility is relatively higher. So these are the different experiences amongst women that feminist strategies need to consider when we think about women's conditions. And about religion, ethnicity, class-based divisions. And I accept intersectional perspective here. I use it as a method, actually. And being Alevi, being Kurdish, or coming from a working class background massively changes this experience as well. So when we look at the experience of Alevi women, I think it was in chapter 6, yes, and we realized that, first of all, if Alevi women are in villages and if they experience a pre-modern form of domestic patriarchy, their conditions are very similar to Turkish women. Like Nimet Okan writes in her book that they are also excluded from land ownership in different ways. So this experience unites their experience with the Turkish Sunni Muslim women, actually. When we look at other experiences that Alevi communities experience, for example, the migrations, there are significant amount of research which shows that Alevi villages have had a much higher rate of outward migration in comparison to Sunni Turkish villages. like post-1980s migration wave, which followed the 1978-1980 massacres in Sivas, Maraş, and Çorum. And again, post-2000s migrations, which followed the 1993 Sivas Madımak massacre. These big waves of migration emptied Alevi villages, and in doing so, detached Alevi women from pre-modern form of patriarchy. And when women migrated to semi-agrarian or non-agrarian cities, Alevi women's accessed education much higher than Sunni women. And then this access led them to experience the conditions of neoliberal patriarchy more than modern patriarchy. Again, when we look at the Kurdish women's experiences, again, if pre-modern patriarchy is very strong in Kurdish regions, actually, and this also creates a kind of a patriarchal culture and religion in those regions. But at the same time, due to the armed conflict, those villages, some of those villages were emptied, like forced migration changed their experience. Because of forced migration, if Kurdish women migrated in semi-agrarian cities, they experienced the conditions of modern domestic patriarchy. But then also some of those women migrated to non-agrarian cities in Turkey or also abroad. Then their experience has drastically changed. So they experience neoliberal and even social democratic form of patriarchy because they live in different countries as well. So this experience is also unique. When we look at the class-based exploitation, it is very important. Like, first of all, I find that class really divides. Like, you can't find unification like Kurdish women and Alevi women. From time to time, their experience converges with Turkish and Sunni Muslim women. But when we talk about class, I find a very sharp distinction. Like, first of all, those women cannot access childcare provision and paid employment. This is another topic, the reasons we can discuss during Q&A if you like, but it's very interesting that Turkish female labor force is predominantly composed of advancedly educated women. And then those women, especially if after having a child, they can't, their access to voting, registering to vote, or taking part in social movements is very limited. So their access to public decision-making, political representation becomes much more limited than other women. And their control over their reproductive abilities is strictly restricted. Like we know, abortion services are not accessible in Turkey unless it's in private hospital, available in private hospitals, and this is affecting working class women drastically. So when we look at women's experiences based on ethnicity, class, and religion, we see that patriarchal oppression and discrimination plays a role in dividing as well as uniting women. But class-based oppression and exploitation is slightly unique, that it really divides women very sharply. So when I think about this map, and then when I realized that there is something called pre-modern domestic patriarchy, I wanted to see how these uneven and combined development of patriarchy, the trajectories of patriarchal transformation, had shaped capitalist trajectories, diversified the ways in which capital accumulation occurred in Turkey. And in order to do that, I compared Turkey with two groups of countries. The first group is the countries that they can never have pre-modern form of domestic patriarchy. Their agrarian structure contrasts Turkish agrarian structure. But the second group of countries are the countries that they are more likely to have pre-modern domestic patriarchy. Here, what I found is, like Gülçin has also mentioned, first of all, I found a significant gender gap in the shift of labor from agriculture to non-agricultural labor. In other words, I found that women are excluded from prioritization. more than other countries, other developing countries. And this exclusion actually created some sort of labor shortage in comparison to other countries. And then under the conditions of labor shortage, in order to reach higher level of competitiveness in the global capitalist markets, employers had to increase the wages relatively, but at the same time increase technology investments much more than Group A countries that you see here, and at the same time increase working hours. So they try to increase their profit by investing in technology and increasing working hours, which at the end increase unemployment in urban areas, non-urban cities. And also, working class reacted very quickly to these pressures, these forms of pressures, because it's purely neoliberalistic capital accumulation strategy. And in order to oppress this working class, in my opinion, capitalist classes in Turkey are in need of authoritarian state regimes more than other countries that I find in Group A. So I'm going to skip this section now in order to finish on time. Here I try to, in the chapter 8, I try to explain why historical materialism is still important for feminist politics, and I try to explain what kind of historical materialism would be useful in comparison to other adaptations of historical materialism. So I try to explain the feminist strategies. How can we increase the effectiveness of feminist strategies in order to destabilize the patriarchal system in Turkey? We have a very strong feminist movement, like streets every time Reclaim the Night March, 8th of March demonstrations are very crowded, photos are amazing, and including myself, we deal with lots of difficulties, tear gas and everything that no one in England deals with. So, but what is going wrong there? Why we don't change this regime? So first of all, I think we need to reconsider few points. So I try to explain 4 points here. The first of all, diversified experiences of women is very important. We need to acknowledge what women under pre-modern patriarchy experience something different to modern domestic patriarchy, and neoliberal form is very different. As our feminism is kind of limited to non-agrarian cities, we don't have so strong connections to other women experiencing different forms of patriarchy. In my opinion, at least until when I was part of feminist movement, we predominantly focus on the experiences of women who experience neoliberal public patriarchy. I think this is one of the strategies that we need to consider. Secondly, again, we still fall into the trap of some reductionisms. Like sometimes in our analysis, we think that capitalism creates patriarchy like this, in this form. Or this also makes us interpret authoritarian regimes in a way which is not gendered, in and of itself authoritarian, something like that. And or we can also draw on the arguments on cultural essentialism. So it's Islamic culture and religion. That's why we have this form of patriarchy. And I disagree with these strategies. And I think we need to avoid those reductionism. Unfortunately, the reality is very complicated. And the collective acting agency, collective acting capacity of the patriarchal subjects is very important in the resilience of this system. So this system reproduces itself with this conscious actions and decisions of these collective subjects. In terms of strategic alliances, like I try to explain in my last piece as well, racism in Turkey draws on the idea that biological reproduction of Turkishness and Sunni Muslimness is important. So there are different forms of racism, and some of them, like in the UK, I don't see this biological connection. But in Turkey, biological reproduction of Turkish Sunni Muslim population within cisgender heterosexual family is very important. When you have such kind of racism in your own country, automatically you need to develop strategic alliances with the oppressed ethnicity, oppressed religion, and also LGBTQ community. I think this alliance is very important generally, but specifically in Turkey or other countries like Turkey, I think India is increasingly becoming like this. When racism has this biological background, it is very important to have these strategic alliances. And I try to answer also Gülçin's questions throughout my presentation, but I'm sure I missed some of them. Family was one of them, I think, a little bit. I can unpack. When we look at the discussions around Istanbul Convention, family played a crucial role. And it is not coincidence that family became much more important than other family discussions going on in the US or in the UK, for example. Because state has multiple agendas, and the racist agenda still, like I mentioned, has a very strong biologically deterministic reproduction. So that is why the family in Turkey had a core role in the debate on Istanbul Convention. So we need to think about this form of family, and we need to think different forms of family, like also Gülçin mentions, like what kind of consent is given, and what kind of different forms of families we can include, and what kind of families can be detached from this biological essentialist debates. And yeah, I tried to answer the questions as well, and we can discuss later during the Q&A. And there is this, the publisher gave a discount if you are interested in purchasing the book. This discount code is valid on online purchasing only, and it will be expired on end of June. So this was for our book launch in Turkey. So thank you so much for your time and listening to me, and sorry that I talked too much.
Thank you so much. No, you had a lot to discuss because it's a very complex book. Like it is almost like a book on its own in each chapter, especially when you get into data analysis. So thank you so much for summarizing for us and also bringing up the discussions. I would like to just see if anybody would like to contribute with any questions or comments at this point. I still have more questions, but I'm trying to stop myself so that.
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much for this great event, actually. I mean, I have been familiar with Ece Hoca's book very recently, and I am so excited when I see this announcement, actually. Thank you very much for your efforts and for your time and investment for all of you. My question is about your method, actually. So especially when you are delving into the differences between the Alevi women, Kurdish women, and working women, what kind of method did you employ? I mean, how did you estimate or measure their engagement with the results of migration? I mean, how they experience the results of migration. So did you conduct an ethnographic research, for example, or I haven't a chance to reach your book, actually. I mean, I am trying to find a copy. So that is why I wonder about your research.
Thank you. Shall we have more questions, or shall I do one-to-one?
You can go ahead and answer this one. There's no question in queue right now.
Thank you. So, in order to have an intersectional approach, I actually drove on gender regime theories. They identify 4 domains. I interpret domains slightly different to those theories, but for me, domains include different forms of social inequalities. They are the fields that I need to focus. So the first domain was called economy domain. So in my opinion, it was important whether or not those women's labor is confined to household and purely unpaid, or confined to farm, again purely unpaid, or they have access to paid employment. So they are experiencing the double burden of paid and unpaid labor. So I focused on this economy domain, and I used existing research to see what's happening to those women. And I also used quantitative data to see, to assess their access to paid labor or not. And the second domain is civil society. I focused on civil society in terms of education, access to education, primary, secondary, and advanced education. And I focused on reproductive rights and their control over their sexuality, sexual orientation. And in civil society domain, I also accessed the political representation and public decision making. So again, I use the same techniques. I use existing research as well as quantitative data, and state produced significant reports on that about those women's experiences as well. And our quantitative data was mostly showing me the working class women's experiences. It was very different. And I managed to find lots of things about working class women. And the third domain I focused was violence. And there is an evidence on violence against women, but femicide evidence doesn't exist. So I had to draw on some media resources, media companies' resources, and this kind of information, media analysis, that kind of information. And also I delve into states' reports, and government produces annual assessment reports, not for us, for United Nations, but those reports are very honest about what they did. Rather than giving promises, they actually provide what has happened. And I benefited those reports a lot in my research. But I will be very happy if you can share your feedback afterwards, and whether or not, of course, there's always room for improvement. That I like to improve my intersectional assessment as well.
Thank you, Hocam.
There is now a question in the chat box. Selin Çağatay is saying, thank you for this wonderful presentation, Ece. I would like to ask a question about public patriarchy in Turkey prior to neoliberalism. Wolbe's differentiation of social democratic versus neoliberal public patriarchy does not seem applicable to non-Western contexts. What kind of public patriarchy existed in Turkey in the early years of the Republic, for example? Can we speak of a coexistence of domestic and public patriarchies in the late Ottoman and early Republican periods?
Thank you, Selin. It's a very interesting question. My analysis, I understand the significance of micro-level assessment, meso, but I focus on macro level a little bit. So when I focus on macro-level analysis, I wouldn't really say that there is a public patriarchy in the late Ottoman, early Republican period. Of course, there are women. Of course, like Candioti says, those elite women experienced public form of patriarchy, but and it requires another mostly qualitative analysis to unpack their experiences. And I think their involvement to paid employment was still very limited, but they were in the public space. So this is another discussion. I wouldn't say that it was social democratic or neoliberal, but in my opinion, when you look at the macro level, I wouldn't say that there was any form of public patriarchy in the early decades of Turkish Republic. And yes, we can talk about coexistence of domestic and public, but not in late Ottoman, early Republican, I think. Non-Western context, I think non-Western context is different. Like when I look at the Latin American countries are dominated by neoliberal public patriarchy. Like women have always been part of labor force, and the proletarian, there is no gender, I didn't find any gender gap in the shift from agriculture to non-agricultural. So in Latin America and some parts of Africa, women have always been in the paid employment, public decision-making, and they are non-Western, but they are dominated by the neoliberal public patriarchy. But when I look at other countries, I don't see neoliberal public patriarchy dominating. It exists, but it doesn't dominate the overall country dynamics, in my opinion. So I can't say that all non-Western countries are under the hegemony of domestic, because they are not. This is very interesting for me. They are still global south. They are still developing. Their economy is not necessarily as good as Turkey's, for example, but neoliberal public patriarchy is there. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, she thanks you. Are there any questions or comments?
I can add a question if that's okay.
Sure.
I was just curious about the feminist movement in Turkey. You said that you have experience with it. You mentioned that in the talk. From my understanding from the US, and I know that, it's such a focus now in the feminist movement in the US these days, or like the third wave feminism focusing on intersectionality as a real core kind of principle. And you mentioned that towards the end. I'm just curious if that's is there like a third wave feminist kind of attitude in Turkey? Is that part of the feminist movement in Turkey, or is there any emphasis on this idea? Because you mentioned there's differences in ethnicity and race, ethnicity and religion, and especially class being a really big difference between some of these groups of women. And so I was just wondering if there's any attention to that at all in the current feminist movement in Turkey, or how well it connects with sort of the broader global feminist movement. And I'm just asking about that because I really don't know that much on the topic, and I'm curious. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think varieties of racisms is an important topic. Like when I look at the racism in the US or the UK or Europe, they all have different racisms. And anti-Black racism has its own dynamics, its own distinguishing features. And feminisms in those countries and intersectionality in those countries established based on those differences as well. And on top of it, capitalisms also are different, and patriarchies are also different. So when we look at the countries like Turkey, India, Pakistan, there is an intersectionality, but I think we also need to consider that our racism exclusively draws on Turkishness and Sunni Muslimness, in my opinion. And that kind of racism requires, and also it draws on the biological reproduction of those productions. So in my opinion, Turkish feminism, Turkish Sunni Muslim feminism has already developed solidarity with the oppressed groups, but in my opinion, it is not enough. I am not sure if we really understand the different experiences of women. We are understanding more and more, but I think we need to spend more effort to improve our intersectional analysis and also politics and solidarities. And I think in that respect, we are watching, of course. I'm not sure about the concept of third wave, because in British context, third wave means very different, like sex positive kind of post-patriarchy kind of discussion. So also I hesitate to declare the existence of waves very quickly. I think Selin also has recently published something on that it's not very easy. I hesitate to call the waves 1 second or something like that. But increasingly, intersectionality is getting important in our context. We need to remember also that our feminism, materialism, has a strong influence on Turkish feminism, historical materialism and social reproduction theories. And when you look at the historical materialist perspective, intersectionality may not satisfy you very much. Like there is one special issue written by Marxist feminists as a critique to intersectionality. I think Theory and Politics, it is the journal in 2006-8. Like this dissatisfaction also stays little bit in Turkish feminism, but increasingly people are trying to engage with differences amongst women. In this respect, I think class is generally dismissed more than other solidarities, and I'm hoping that we can improve our approaches more on that topic. Sorry, not a clear answer, just a debate on that.
No, it's interesting. Thank you very much. I can see, yeah, the differences, like how the waves don't necessarily apply in the same context. Like that's very interesting to think about.
Thank you. Zoyla Jam has a question in the chat box. She thanks you very much for your impressive presentation, and she would like to ask you about the practical side of writing a book that I was also going to ask. What were the main difficulties you faced, and what recommendations can you give us on writing books?
Thank you so very much. And practical, I think main difficulty was the book is written under the conditions of pandemic. So I have finished the first drafts in pure isolation by myself. And it had advantages and disadvantages. And disadvantages that I couldn't have a platform to discuss and then share the excitement, my ideas. My partner had to listen to lots of ideas of mine. And advantages, of course, it gave me lots of time. Like the first year of pandemic, the first 6-8 months were very productive, I think. We had lots of time to do lots of research, but then everything went in the opposite side. But it was also helpful, the first chunk of the pandemic. And in terms of practical side, unfortunately, academia is increasingly getting a space of proletarian, like we are proletarian academics. It is not like 20 years ago. Like we don't have whole summer holidays, term breaks, that we can just shut down teaching, do our research. So I think as proletarian academic, it's important to adopt some of the techniques that others are suggesting. Inherently, the place we are in is not right, and it is not, there's a huge injustices in our location in the academia, but at the same time, I had to accept some of the methods that they followed, like serial writer, Rowena Moray, she writes these kind of things. So every day she says, you can allocate I did every day, whatever happens, I allocated 90 minutes of writing, 90 minutes of my own research, and whatever happens, teaching, marking, student meetings, I had to do that 90 minutes every day. Otherwise, I would never finish this book.
Thank you. Related to that, actually, I was going to ask you a further difficulty you might have faced because of focusing on Turkey. Turkey is not necessarily known for a good archival data. Probably secondary data analysis is further complex and difficult because, for example, if you were going to do this in the United States, that was something that always amazed me. Like there would be the annals of agriculture, right? Like published every year, for example, or letters
Yeah.
like from even like, you know, people in rural areas to other people. So you can also understand the everyday life experiences, like more micro level. So did you have any complication where you wanted to reach some, you know, formal, especially public data, and you couldn't because you faced some obstacles, and did this stress you out?
I mean, in terms of quantitative data, the limitations of quantitative data in Turkey, statistics, is not very different to other countries. So globally, there is a lack of data on women in agriculture. So globally, we are all trying to find alternative ways. So I follow the same trajectory. But in terms of quantitative data, was more or less the same. Qualitative data, in terms of archives and everything, British Library helped me a lot here. So I'm very surprised. So whatever I needed, they found it within like 3 weeks time period. The books written in early 19th century, the books written in early 20th century, they managed to find everything. There were very few resources that I needed to go to Turkey and collect them by myself and photocopy or read them and come back. The British Library provided lots of archival materials to me.
That is one of the advantages of the context that you were writing the book.
I think so.
Are there any further questions or comments? Because I can keep going, but I'm trying to hold myself. I actually have one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I'm just waiting for like other people to jump in before I dominate. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question or comment, provide any feedback? Okay, you can still write in the chat box or like jump in, but another area of my research is aging. So currently I find myself talking about older women all the time in any context because somehow people discovered that there are also older women. Because you can also understand that in feminism as well, there's much more focus on middle-aged women, even like not children, not girls, but women who are productive, who are reproductive, etc., etc. So when I was reading your book, you mentioned the exploitation of child labor within the same family, but you mentioned that it's temporary, it's not a permanent thing, like, you know, in the case of a husband exploiting the wife's labor. What happens to the woman getting like older? Because she will stop being useful in terms of, you know, reproductive purposes. She will also be useless in terms of production, at least in the formulation of current production relations. Yeah, like older people are not really welcomed in further providing any, you know, surplus to the system. And on top of that, they will be dependent. Like they will be dependent on their own daughters-in-law, or any other woman who have to also take the burden of providing older care work. So do you see that in our feminist alliances and feminist strategies, there can be another component, because intersectionality mostly forgets or dismisses age as an important factor in intersectionality. do you see that this is also very fundamental, and in what ways? And again, like back to my question, what happens to older women? Do we still care about them, consider like their role in the system one way or another? Or do we just like leave them out of the equation?
And this is a very good question. I also didn't focus on older women like you mentioned. And in my analysis, they appeared in different places, like older women in rural households or urban households. What I found, in my opinion, was interesting was childcare was handled by older women in households rather than nurseries for a long time. But since 2011, that proportion of children looked after their grandmother, paternal, maternal grandmothers didn't increase. It's stuck a little bit. So those women, some of them, or privileged background older women, they might refuse looking after their grandchildren, or actually they can't get retired. They have to still work for a wage or salary or any kind of payment. Those women are not now the backbone of childcare system anymore. That was interesting in my opinion. But certainly, of course, we need to consider that differences, age-based differences amongst women. Also, what I couldn't do, I know that, like, when I discuss with other feminists, they sometimes they are critical of women joining paid labor because paid labor conditions are really bad. So why do you want them to leave agriculture and move to factories and stuff like that? This was another debate that sometimes we do. That's why I try to propose kind of an exit package for rural women, not just like pushing them to urban areas. But we also need to consider not all female peasants are heterosexual. Like, unfortunately, that critique ignores the fact that female peasants are not heterosexual, but they have to get married. So what it means to them is totally ignored. For example, like female peasants are all assumed heterosexual. It's also interesting dimension, I think. Like, we need to improve our analysis in that sense.
Yeah, I do understand that in macro-analysis, this becomes like invisible or more blurry. For example, what you mentioned, older women either refusing or somehow getting out of that childcare work. I did study that, and what I found was, and it's obviously related to demographic transformations, because women are now having their first baby at much older ages than their own mothers are more likely to be older, therefore not in the situation of freely running after a baby. They have their own health problems, or their spouses are relying on them, or they are geographically distant, or they just don't want to. I listen to a lot of women saying like, I did my work, I raised them, like, I'm not doing this again. I'm going to finally live my own life. So that is obviously going to affect all the discourse of the Turkish state, because they rely on the grandmothers a lot, or this intergenerational solidarity in terms of sustaining this commercialized care work, especially for lower SES women, because they cannot afford those commercial daycares and stuff. But at the same time, another aspect of being an older woman is that you are more likely to be a widow. And being a widow is not a good thing necessarily. You might be alone, you might be devoid of any kind of means of income, but at the same time, the patriarch is gone. Like, I do hear from a lot of women after a period of mourning, they do finally feel independent in terms of making their own decisions, and like finally having some oxygen in their life. So that's also interesting. Like, look, I'm not saying that they are now exited like from the patriarchal system. I wouldn't dare to, but at the same time, like, being a widow is a very different experience that we mostly do not necessarily address in our feminist research.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I don't think that there are any further questions or comments currently in the chat box or among the people who are still with us. Again, I can continue chatting with you about your book and all the related issues till the midnight or something. But it's been almost 2 hours and we are recording, so that was very productive. We covered a lot of things. We covered the whole book and all the whole discussion. And I would like to thank all the participants for their valuable comments and questions as well. And thank you so much, obviously, first and foremost, because you accepted our invitation and you were very, very helpful from the very beginning. We really appreciate that. That makes us feel more courageous to just reach out to authors of books and discuss their books with a broader audience. So thank you so much for everything, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience as well, listening to me talking.
No problem. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned for the further events of the TEDU Center for Gender Studies. There's one upcoming event on this Friday in person and on Zoom. We will have I will always have problem with the English version, combating gender-based violence, right? In like the university organizations are coming together, but you're welcome to join and listen to the conversations. We are announcing everything through our social media as well. And yeah, have a nice day, I guess. And let's just get rid of patriarchy as the final message.